Welcome on in, everyone, to NJ Advanced Media's live National Signing Day show. I'm Joe Giglio, joined by Todderick, our recruiting expert, as we're going to bring you everything going on from Rutgers to the big kids here in New Jersey, where they're going to land. Today, Todderick, it's a fun day, as you have all these kids that work so hard to get to this point, and now they can commit and decide where they're going to go play in college.
Absolutely. Like you said, the biggest day of the year for college football fans, probably besides the national championship game, where fans get to see which of these top kids will go to their favorite schools, their alma maters, and the kids get to put on their coats and ties and hop on ESPN and programs such as this to announce. And huge moment for their families. They've gone through 18 years of struggle, of hard work to get to this point, on-field achievements, off-the-field achievements. Obviously, you need to do well in the classroom in order for these signings to mean anything, because you have to qualify academically, so that's certainly an achievement as well. So it all kind of works together and culminates in this huge event.
It does, and we'll get you everything going on at Rutgers, the kids that are nationally ranked in New Jersey, where they're going. Before we get into all that, Todderick, just as an overview, this class this year for New Jersey, we know New Jersey's usually, despite us not being the biggest state, we churn out a lot of good players. Is this another one of those years where there's a lot of really good players coming out and heading to college?
Certainly along the lines of where New Jersey is usually at. I like to say it's the strongest state per capita throughout the entire country. When you take a look at the size of the state, probably the second smallest state throughout the country, yet annually, on an every year basis, send about 60 to 70 players to Division 1A football.
You wouldn't know it by the size, yeah.
Anywhere from 100 to 120 players overall when you talk about Division 1, which includes FCS ball. Mm-hmm. So certainly a strong football state. This year is certainly on par. You got about 60 guys committing to 1A schools at this point. You'll have a few more guys trickle in maybe after signing day, maybe a few specialists and guys that are working through some academic things who may qualify late to add to that total.
Yeah, so we're going to get you all the news as it comes in. And let's start here with, before we get to the names of this year, just kind of a look back at last year, Todderick, with Rutgers, and then we'll get into their class and what we know about what they're doing right now. And we're doing this live, and we're having players sign and commit as this goes along all day long. But as of now, let's take a look back, Todderick. Last year, Rutgers, the first year under Chris Ash, when you look at what they did last year and you look at where they're trying to go, what do you think they needed to focus on? What were the big needs for them going into this particular signing day?
Well, obviously, you take a look at the games from last season when Janarian Grant goes down to injury. You got to see the holes in what Rutgers was trying to do out there. They looked like a team, certainly fit for Big Ten play. All of a sudden, you have your best player go down, and you're looking for answers. You're looking for playmakers, which are basically guys that make things happen with the ball in their hands, especially on the offensive side of the ball when you're trying to run this wide open spread offensive concept. Even though it's more of a power spread with a tight end concept, you still need guys that can make plays in space, and that's certainly what was lacking this past season.
So when you look at what Rutgers was trying to do and New Jersey's best players, did it match up this year? Was this a good year to need playmakers, or did they have to look outside of the state to make sure they landed the kind of kids they need to fit in their program right now?
There were certainly some guys in New Jersey. I think they capitalized with a couple of those guys, Bo Melton especially.
And you've been talking him up for a while now.
Absolutely. Bo Melton, compact, 6'1", 190-pound kid, makes plays in space. Also pretty well put together for a 190-pounder. You'll see plays where he's carrying players on his back.
So he's got power, too.
He's a strong kid, also makes plays in the return game. Really shifty, crafty, beyond his years, and the way he sees the game, sees the field, and sort of sees the way the block's set up before things happen. Certainly a key player. Has a younger brother at his high school as well that stepped up and made some huge plays this past season as a freshman. So great bloodlines there.
Now, when we look at the kids that Rutgers is going to bring in here, and it could be any freshman, right? It could be a top recruiter, or it could be a kid that maybe doesn't have a 5-star or a 4-star. When people watch this and they start hearing these names like Bo Melton, how much can we realistically expect, right? We have these conversations every year, but you watch these kids like Melton and these kids in high school. When Rutgers finishes their class today, do you think we can expect a lot out of these kids in September, or is this more of a step one to hopefully the next 2 or 3, 4 years?
Well, one thing that's really changed the game is the evolution of the early enrollment, the ability to get kids on campus early in January. They get to go through an entire spring, an entire summer. They become fully acclimated So by the time the season rolls around, they're pretty well seasoned. They haven't played. They don't have any in-game experience as far as throughout the season, but they've trained with the guys. They've
Makes a big difference.
been through the same process, bonded with the guys. They've got acclimated to being a student, a collegiate student, and basically being on your own and being responsible. So it certainly changed the game. Rutgers bringing in 4 of those guys, headlined by Micah Clark, the top player in the NJ.com top 50, who's a magnificent player, projects on both sides of the ball. It'll be interesting to see what they do with him. But that's certainly changed the game and allowed those young guys to step in there and create an early impact.
So when you look at their class as we know it right now, how do you feel about this Rutgers recruiting class and the names that we know? And you mentioned Melton and Micah Clark and the kids and the 4 you said that are coming in here early. How do you feel right now, and how should Rutgers fans feel right now as what we know about this Rutgers recruiting class?
I always sit there and wonder when you get a tweet, about how the class is going and, Ash is missing out on some guys late. And I always have to sit back and ask, did we just watch the same season? This is a team that's coming off a 2-win season. They've got 25 kids committed right now, most of which can make some sort of impact, I would expect, moving forward. And a lot of good guys in this class. You talk about Micah Clark. You talk about guys like Melton, a guy like Eddie Lewis, who I love, who they were able to grab today on signing day, who can make plays in the open field, scored on the hook and ladder.
Playmaker.
To win his team a state championship. So these are the type of guys that start to turn the tide. I think Ash was really diligent throughout this entire recruiting cycle. They had a couple losses, guys that decommitted, but they hung in there. They kept fighting. And even those guys that decommitted, they stayed on them and they worked it. So they did everything within their powers to make this class as good as possible. I believe it is as good as possible. And there's certainly a number of guys in this class that can impact the field.
So when you look at the kids, and I'm sure you spoke to a lot of them that decided Rutgers is for me, what is it? Because you just mentioned the season we just watched. It was not a good season for Rutgers football. Anyone who watched any minute of it knows that. So what do they sell them on? What is Rutgers selling these kids on that are committing to them? Is it Chris Ash? Is it the new strength and conditioning program? What is it? Why would kids go there other than, it's a scholarship? Like, what is Rutgers offering to these kids right now, in your mind?
Well, I think you touched on 2 things. I think Chris Ash himself coming in and looking to overhaul the program, speaking to the right things, being able to sell the vision of what's to come here at Rutgers. The strength and conditioning program is certainly highly acclaimed, at least by the Rutgers staff. And physically, you can sort of see the results just kind of standing on the sidelines this year, looking at the bigs, the D linemen, the O linemen.
Look more like a Big Ten.
They certainly look fit. They look like Big Ten guys. Now, did that necessarily translate to the field? Not necessarily in year one, but you'd hope to see that moving forward and covering the team. But those are certainly 2 pieces of it. At the same time, a lot of these guys in New Jersey have pride, want to be able to stay home, represent their home team. Looking out there, watching a Rutgers game from home, you obviously, a 2-win team. They struggled offensively and defensively. You're sitting there as a recruit thinking, maybe I can be the difference. Maybe I have an opportunity to go there and make an early impact, see the field early, increase my chances of going pro at the tail end of my career. So there's certainly a lot of positives and things to certainly think about. Or you can go somewhere in which they've won national titles year after year, go to Alabama where they have a history of that type of thing, and just be one of a million guys. Or you could be the guy that stays home and be the reason to bring that success to your university.
Yeah, and the kids we're going to talk about here on this show, they're going to try to be that. They're going to try to help turn Rutgers around. We'll get back into this Rutgers class, what we know about it and who. But Tyler, let's talk about some of the biggest names in New Jersey right now, because obviously not all of them are heading to Rutgers, and they head out to other schools, different schools. Some in the Big Ten, some will be rivals of Rutgers, some will not. The one that a couple this morning that we talked about and we heard about, but Bryce Wats, a kid that is going to go to Virginia Tech and a kid from Toms River North, and he actually spoke about his decision to stay with Virginia Tech and to do that. And Bryce Wats was a kid that we were all paying attention to, and he had some interesting things to say. So Watts is a kid that stayed at Virginia Tech, which that was interesting because we weren't sure about him as we headed into this whole process.
Right, and I mean, I thought initially Watts was a kid, and I still think so, with high developmental upside on the tail end. Certainly fast, twitchy, explosive. Maybe wasn't quite as productive throughout his high school career as far as getting those opportunities. I thought Carrington was a guy offensively who made a lot of plays and may have been the better high school football wide receiver on the team. But you look tail end, you look potential. Bryce Wats certainly a guy with the type of speed to make plays in the Big Ten, take the top off the defense offensively, and also at cornerback, certainly twitchy enough, can bend, can open up his hips and run to play some corner as well. And which is why I think a lot of teams were interested, got involved late. Unfortunately for Rutgers fans, flipped from Rutgers late to Virginia Tech, but he'll be looking to bring that skill set down into Blacksburg.
Another kid that this morning we got the news on, it was kind of up in the air. Would it be Rutgers? Would it not be? Cory Bolts from Paramus Catholic is going to go to Penn State. So that will be a story, I'm sure, for years now as he becomes a rival of Rutgers. Before we get into Bolts, and I want to get your opinion on him, how hard is that, Todderick? And you're around these kids and these schools. Like this morning, when we go into this, or even last night, like kids are changing their mind. And you and I were just talking about before we went on the air that some of these kids, they know, but then some of them, you don't know. You wake up this morning and, we were watching a video of a kid that took on the Florida Gators shirt, and then Seminoles, and then it was USC. Like, it's got to be hard for these schools to watch and not know.
I mean, it's certainly a tough time. I like to blame it more so on the process than the kids themselves.
Right, it's an event now.
It's crazy. I mean, you got a lot of analysts and critics who want to blame the kids and say, oh, you have no integrity.
They're 17 years old.
You're decommitting. These are young kids making decisions that will affect the rest of their lives. On the flip side, you got head coaches that get new jobs, leave the team, hop on a flight without saying bye to the team and explaining what's going on, never to return again. So when we talk about accountability, that's something that I think has to fall on both sides of the plane. So I certainly don't feel any negativity towards kids when they do change their minds. 17, 18-year-old kids, that is going to happen sometimes.
Yeah, and let me think about it. This is probably the last time for maybe all these kids or most of them, they get to choose for a long time, right? Like if these kids are lucky enough to make it to the NFL, they'll get drafted into the NFL, right? It'll take them a long time to ever, how many of them? Like 1% will become an NFL star and they get to pick where they want to play. This is their time to pick their school. I don't think it's a big deal that they make a big event of it.
I mean, overall, you can't argue that the process itself is silly. Yeah. It needs to be reworked. I'd love to see an early signing period.
Maybe no fax machines?
And it'd be easier on the coaches as well because, you're implementing resources throughout the entire year. And a saying that coaches usually like to say is recruiting doesn't really start until a kid commits to your school. Then you're working so hard because, especially if he's an in-state kid, you offer him. What's naturally going to happen is all of these other schools, D1A schools, are going to say, okay, the hometown school offered them without really doing the proper vetting. They'll say, you know what, he must be FBA approved and stamped. Let's offer him as well. So you open up the floodgates for some of these other schools to come in. That's what a lot of the fans don't understand. They'll say, hey, Rutgers, why won't you be his first offer? How'd you miss out on this kid? And why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? And just talking to some guys, the reason for that sometimes is you don't want to overexpose the kid by offering him. Doesn't mean you don't want the kid. You still want him, and that's the reason why you're not offering him, so other teams don't discover who he is and then follow suit.
There's a strategy to the whole thing.
Absolutely.
And landing these kids.
It's all about strategy.
It is, and you have to try to make sure by today that strategy pays off. We'll get into Rutgers' recruiting class and what we know in a few minutes. Let's look back, though, Tyler, because we mentioned Chris Ash and trying to set the foundation here. So he has a little bit of a foundation, right? This will now be Chris Ash's second year. We did this show last year when it was his first year after he was named the head coach. When you look back on Chris Ash's first year, I'm not talking about the results on the field. I'm not talking about the games they won, lost. The kids they brought in last year. What was your overall impression of what you saw and what you heard about the freshmen Chris Ash had that now will be sophomores?
Well, it was a class, he obviously got in there late, had to fight tooth and nail to hang on to some guys. Some guys left. Anthony Russo went to Temple. He was probably one of the leaders of that class, the spokesman for that class. A lot of transition as far as the coaching staff completely being flipped. So there'll be a lot of turnover there and things that happened. Overall, wasn't the strongest class, certainly. There were some playmakers in there that I liked, a guy like Damon Hayes. Certainly thought he was a player. Julius Turner, young defensive tackle, explosive, undersized, but I can certainly potentially see him making some plays. Michael Maietti, the center out of Don Bosco, a little bit undersized, wasn't highly recruited, but a guy that early on really has shown something throughout the program. Tyreke Williams, linebacker out of Timber Creek. They got him at like the 24th hour, and he's a guy that played significantly throughout this past season.
He got that experience, yeah.
KJ Gray got on the field. I think Alorm Lumore will eventually be a player that can contribute. Nick Kremen, the prototype physically has everything you want. And then once he develops and gets some coaching underneath him, I think he could be a player. Solomon Manning, obviously the same thing. And Tylen Oden, a kid that we saw on the field in live action, doing some things. We saw his ability to run. We didn't really see them get to open up the offense with him and throw the football around, but he certainly has a big arm, and hopefully we'll get to see how accurate that arm is next season.
All right, so here's when we can talk about the important thing for right now, for today. Who's joining them, right? Who are the kids that we know are heading to Rutgers? Let's start with Micah Clark. You talked about him a few minutes ago. What does he bring to the table, and what do you think he can be for Rutgers once they get him in the program and get him up to speed?
Brings a ton to the table. I think the key word is versatility. He's a guy that can fill multiple needs on both sides of the football. Recruited as an offensive tackle. I wrote something up the other day that had people's wheels turning. How I could see him projecting to an elite center, a Kevin Mawai type at 6'4",
it's high
280
praise.
pounds. Because the kid is long, but he can bend. He can bend. He does his best work in a short area. Gets his hands on you quickly.
Sounds like a center to me.
Can do some skip pulling, some trap pulling. I think he'd be a terror inside. But I think when you talk about getting him on the field quickly, which is what I'm assuming they want to do, they may move him to the defensive side of the ball. I know Chris Ash is in favor of seeing him on that side of the ball. And if he were to do so, I'm thinking probably 3 technique. That's probably where he lines up from a size, athleticism standpoint right now. Probably about 270, 75 pounds right now. Maybe get him up to about 285, where he can just kind of shoot some gaps, rip that inside arm through, bend down the line and find the football to make some plays. I think that's where he can probably make the earliest impact. Offense is a little different. They always say the closer you are to the football, the harder your transition from high school to the next level.
Right.
But I think defensive line, where you can just kind of watch the football, get off that ball, and utilize your natural ability to make plays. You got to learn a few things about, how not to be trapped. Obviously you don't want to play too tall. But you can scheme that, you can get guys in gaps and get those guys making plays. So I think that's where he could have an immediate contribution if they choose to put him there.
Yeah, it sounds like someone the coaches are going to have to be so excited to bring in, because you can mold him, and like you're saying, almost into anything you want if he's got this much versatility. So Micah Clark, certainly a big name. Let's talk about Bo Melton, someone that I remember during our podcast, our Rebuilding Rutgers podcast during the season. You had mentioned Bo Melton's name and kind of the specter of him landing here. Now he's coming here to Rutgers. What can Bo Melton bring to the table?
Well, Rutgers picked up Amir Mitchell, who had originally committed to Michigan the prior year, and ended up transferring over to Rutgers, and they'll be able to go this spring. And Bo Melton obviously was actually on that same Cedar Creek team. He was a year behind Amir, but for Amir's senior year, it was actually Bo Melton who sort of took that team over, had the better year. Both guys obviously were great, but they were able to use Amir as a little bit more of a decoy because he had so much attention on him being this big-time recruit, and it really allowed Bo Melton to flourish, open things up, and people started to looking at this young man like, wow, this kid is pretty special, and he could be a D1A kid as well. And then slowly over time, he started to make plays. He started to be more consistent with it and show what he can do with the ball in his hands, on defense, with interceptions, in special teams, in the return game, and with his toughness and physicality. I said 190 pounds earlier, probably closer to 185 pounds, but there's plays that you can pull up on YouTube, on Huddle, with him carrying defenders on his back, so that certainly shows his toughness as well.
So now Rutgers has both of those kids.
Right.
Let's talk about Tyshawn Fog now and what his game can translate to in the Big Ten and for Rutgers.
Well, Tyshawn Fog is a big kid who can really run. I remember when he was going into his junior year, just sort of watching him at camps, that was the main thing that stood out. And that's what you kind of look for as an analyst, big kids who can really run. You're not necessarily wondering worried about them being technically sound and things of that nature.
Stuff. You can learn
Because
that
you
stuff.
can teach that stuff. You don't know what type of coaching a kid is getting in high school, but you certainly want a nice lump of clay that you can formulate into something
Real
special.
talent, yeah.
And he's one of those guys, can fly around, find the football, good size at 6'2", 215, 220 pounds, can finish when he gets to what he sees, and can certainly be a guy that they work into the defense. Maybe a strong side linebacker, a big guy that can sort of match up with the tight ends in coverage, and can do some of those things with the underneath receivers, and can also bring the wood.
Let's talk about Jonathan Lewis. We'll end with him as one of our big four names for Rutgers that's going to be there and be a Scarlet Knight. Jonathan Lewis, why should Scarlet Knights fans be excited about this name?
Well, I'll tell you, he looks great on the hoof at 6'4", 225 pounds, big, strong frame, stands tall in a pocket, and has an absolute rocket on his arm.
Is he the guy? Is he the next quarterback? Is he the quarterback that Rutgers is waiting for?
Well, I certainly like Tyler Oden, and I'd like to see what he can do in the passing game as well. And Gio Rosigno has certainly earned the opportunity to compete for that job as well. But Jay Lou is certainly a guy. Physically, I think he can hold up to the rigors of running the power spread because, again, you have to be able to run the football as a quarterback and take hits and still get up off the ground and stay in that game to keep that continuity going. So he certainly has the build for it, certainly has the athleticism for it, has a big arm. One thing I think he improved on between his junior and senior years is his accuracy. Those balls used to sail on him a little bit, was able to really follow through this season and get them down. And watching the first game against Paramus Catholic, he made some throws on that last drive that made me say, you know what, this kid may just be ready. He missed out on Elite 11 this year, and you don't get that far without being able to throw the football. So certainly a guy, definitely the top dual threat quarterback in New Jersey as a senior. Arguably the top quarterback, him and Tommy DeVito, who's going to Syracuse, both in that conversation, but certainly a huge coup for Rutgers.
So for our watchers out there, our viewers and Rutgers fans that are watching this right now and have never seen Jonathan Lewis, right? They just heard or read what you've written about him. How quickly do you think he could play, right? Because the Rutgers last year we saw, it was like quarterback carousel, and there's nothing in stone, even though there's some guys coming back that have some experience now in this system. How quickly do you think this kid, based on his career in high school and then everything you were talking about, can he be ready to play? I mean, is this a kid we could be talking about sometime in the beginning or middle of next season that he hits the field and he plays?
Well, I think that depends on what Gio Rosigno and Tyler Oden bring to the table next year. Older guys that have been in the fire, they've gotten some experience. And even though it's been limited, there's something to say for that experience and actually, being in the mess, with bullets flying around and be able to deliver the ball downfield. Tyler Oden certainly didn't get to throw many passes, but did some tremendous things with his feet. So he'll certainly have a shot as well. For a freshman quarterback coming in, you'd like to see those guys enroll early in order to get that spring to go through,
Especially
that entire
for them.
summer to go through.
They need those mental reps.
And you got to be able to lead. So it's tough to come in and lead without completely knowing the playbook, without having gone through a spring and really having gotten the guys to trust you. So it's certainly a possibility. If I had to bet on it, I think those other guys start out the season with those opportunities. But I think he could be a guy that gets worked in for a chance to compete for that job later on in the season. But then as a staff, you have to sit back and really figure out if it's worth burning his red shirt.